This is Global Tennessee, news, analysis, and commentary from the Tennessee World Affairs Council in Nashville. Global Tennessee is produced in association with the Center for International Business at Belmont University and the International Business Council of the Nashville Area Chamber of Commerce. The World Affairs Council is a nonpartisan, nonprofit educational association, and the views expressed on Global Tennessee are those of the participants.
Welcome to the June 30th edition of the Tennessee World Affairs Council's Global News Review. I'm Patrick Ryan. I'm joined by Ambassador Dick Bowers, Dr. Breck Walker, and Dr. Mark Katz. Thanks for joining us, everybody. We have a really full house of expertise here as we dive into the news topics. We're going to introduce Breck Walker, who was with us and is now joining us as a regular member of our news review, and also talk with Dr. Mark Katz, who's here as a guest co-host. But I also wanted to update people on Ambassador Dick Bowers. We haven't mentioned what he's done. And before I introduce our other two guests, let me remind everybody that Ambassador Bowers served as the U.S. ambassador in Bolivia from 1991 through 1994. And during that time, the American embassy in Bolivia was the largest and most complex embassy in South America. He grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area, attended the University of California, Berkeley. Dick, what is the Berkeley? That's the Bears, right?
Yeah, the Golden Bears.
Golden Bears.
I didn't just attend, Pat. I graduated. Just for the record.
All right. He entered the Foreign Service in 1967. From 61 to 64, he served in the U.S. Army as a Russian linguist in West Berlin, one of those spies in a bunker somewhere at the height of the Cold War. As a member of the U.S. Diplomatic Corps, Ambassador Bowers served in the U.S. embassies in Panama, Poland, Singapore, Germany, and Bolivia. He retired from the Foreign Service in 1995. He's been a board member of the Tennessee World Affairs Council since 2012. Dr. Breck Walker, who's the newest addition to our news review team here, received his Ph.D. in diplomatic history from Vanderbilt University in 2007. His dissertation was on the foreign policy of the Carter administration. He taught at Sewanee, the University of the South, on the University of Virginia's Semester at Sea program, and he's worked as a historian at the Office of the Secretary of Defense in researching a book on Pentagon's cyber policy. Prior to becoming a history professor, Breck worked for 20 years as an investment banker. The last 10 as co-head of the corporate finance group at J.C. Bradford and Company in Nashville. He also serves on the board of the World Affairs Council. Today we welcome Dr. Mark Katz, Professor of Government and Politics at George Mason University in Northern Virginia. He writes on Russian foreign policy, the international relations of the Middle East, transnational revolutionary movements, and other subjects. During 2017, he was a visiting scholar, first at the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington, then at the Finnish Institute of International Affairs in Helsinki. 2018, he was a Fulbright scholar at the School of Oriental and African Studies, or SOAS, in London, and then the 2018 Sir William Luce Fellow at Durham University in the UK, where I had the opportunity to see him lecture one fine English day. In February 2019, he was appointed a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. And you can find links to all of his many articles on our website and at www.marknkatz.com. Welcome, gentlemen. Thanks for joining us on the news review.
Great to be here. Thanks.
Before we get going, let me mention that July is membership month at the Tennessee World Affairs Council. We invite you to become members of the World Affairs Council. We have to pay the light bill, and now that we have an extra hand on the news review, there'll be extra snacks in the break room that we have to account for. So please consider becoming a member of the World Affairs Council or providing a gift. You can do that at tnwac.org. Please start adding your questions to the Q&A tab in the Zoom screen as they come to you. We will try to get them throughout the program, but we can also save some for the end. That's it. Dick, do you want to lead us through our topics today?
Well, we got our kind of 5 topics today, Pat. We're going to start off with a topic that I like the title of, Thucydides Takes a South China Sea Cruise. And Pat, will you explain all that? And then we're moving on to Russia, Vladimir the Great. Putin can serve now through 2036. Third, Russia's murder for hire program in Afghanistan. We're going to talk about that and what's going on and why. And 4, back to Asia with Hong Kong, the end of one city and 2 systems and what that bodes for the world and our relationships with China. And finally, we're going to talk about Iran and why are there fires breaking out? What's going on there? So those are our 5 topics. I'm ready to go, Pat.
Okay, and we're going to start with our weekly quiz question. And Breck was asked to do this, and he's mastered the language concern. So Breck, over to you.
Sure, I hope so. We'll see. But I wanted to remind everyone that the Tennessee World Affairs Council does give a weekly quiz that you can access either on our website or on our newsletter that comes out on Monday. And Tennessee World Affairs Council members can compete for a monthly prize in that contest. So I encourage everybody to give that a look. So our question for today is, 20 Saudi Arabian citizens were put on trial in absentia in Turkey July 3rd, charged in the murder of what prominent reporter at the Saudi consulate in Istanbul in 2018? And the answers are A, Thumar al-Marzuki, B, Jamal Khashoggi, C, Badr al-Ibrahim, and D, Mohammed al-Sadiq. And I don't think I'll go back over those again. And we'll have the answer to that at the conclusion of our talk today.
All right, Pat, you're going to cue up the Thucydides Takes a South China Sea Cruise.
I sure will. And just to let you know, Dick, we may have an audio issue here. So if I disappear from the screen momentarily, I'll hand it off to you. But we are certainly going to talk about what's going on in the South China Sea. There's a news peg to the story, but just a little background on what's up for stake in the South China Sea. This has been a contentious issue for decades. I can remember cruising in those waters in my Navy days, and the Spratlys and the Paracels were being fought over, and that was in the mid-'80s. So these contested islands, and there are a number of countries that you can see on the screen that have various claims for different parts of the South China Sea, the basin in Southeast Asia. It's a strategic waterway. 1/3 of the world's shipping passes through the South China Sea, and you can draw a line from Singapore to the southwest, where especially oil shipments come from the Middle East, but all sorts of merchant traffic passes from Singapore through the South China Sea, up through the Bashi Channel, and then on to Korea, Japan, and so forth. So 1/3 of the world's shipping through there. And the South China Sea itself is a very important region because of the oil and gas and fisheries that it provides there. Now, China's claim, and we'll show this a little bit more distinctly, but you can see these dashed lines starting at Taiwan, working down along the coastline of the Philippines.
So the dashed line basically is China, who has throughout most of history not pushed itself out into these nautical areas, now has done so by basically claiming that its territorial waters go out that far to the dashed line. So the dashed line, Permanent Court of Arbitration in 2016 basically ruled that China has no claim. And these other countries, the Philippines, Vietnam, Taiwan, Malaysia, Brunei, Indonesia, they all have claims to various small, little, dinky, tiny-sized land masses out there in the South China Sea that China is now building up and claiming as their own. This puts the U.S. and China in a kind of a standoff, if not a collision course, because we believe in the freedom of navigation of the seas, and wherever we can legally navigate, we plan to do so. So recently, the United States has moved a couple of aircraft carriers into some areas that are disputed by the Chinese. So the United States has moved this carrier battle group and is conducting exercises in the area. The Chinese are reacting and saying you shouldn't be doing that. The Philippines, which in recent years has been backing away from its long-term strategic relationship with the United States, has now gone back towards the United States because of their concern about what China is doing in the South China Sea. So there's a full discussion of this is going to come up on July the 28th at 7 p.m. with Admiral Bill Owens, who's retired and was the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And the subject's going to be U.S.-China relationship. So you can go to tnwac.org and calendar and sign up to make sure you can get on that July 28th. I think we should move on to Vladimir the Great. Mark, are you up?
I am up.
All right.
Okay. Yes. Well,
Why is he called Vladimir the Great?
Well, I'm not sure he is.
Wasn't there an Ivan the Great? How long did
Ivan the Terrible?
Ivan
and, yes, and Peter the Great.
Okay.
That was how it worked. But maybe you can call him Putin the Terrible. I don't know. In any event, what we've seen is the recent referendum on the constitutional amendments to allow Putin to stay in office potentially until 2036. Now, the way it works in Russia is it's ostensibly similar to how it works here in the U.S. That the president is allowed to have 2 consecutive terms. When Putin first came in, he served 2 consecutive 4-year terms, 2000 to 2004, 2004 to 2008. And then, despite the calls of his henchmen to amend the Constitution to let him run again, he modestly refused, and he switched with his then Prime Minister.
Hello, Dick. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All
Welcome
right.
back, Pat.
Anyway, he switched.
I think we're halfway there. I can't hear you guys.
Well, Mark's talking.
Anyway, he switched with Medvedev. He became, prime minister as he was at the very end of the Yeltsin years, and Putin was president. And people at the time, I remember, thought that Putin was doing like Deng Xiaoping. He was handing over, power to the next generation. But it turned out that apparently, especially with regard to the matter in Libya, not vetoing the UN Security Council resolution in 2011, allowing for a no-fly zone, and then of course we all saw what happened. There was intervention, and Gaddafi was overthrown. It seems to have contributed to Putin's decision to come back, and so he ran again in 2012. Only this time, the Constitution had been amended to change the term of office to 6 years. So he was elected in 2012 and then re-elected in 2018. The idea was that 2024 he has to go. But it turns out he doesn't want to go. And so the beginning of this year, they started talking about certain changes. But basically, he doesn't want to do what he did previously with Medvedev, because it's a 6-year term to be prime minister. He kind of likes being president, and so he got his legislature and his courts to approve the reset to 0 for his term, and then he decided to hold this referendum, which he didn't necessarily have to, but he did, and it's a whole set of things, basically, that there are all kinds of, social benefits and this and that. And not surprisingly, the referendum was passed. And so now we have the potential for Putin to stay in office till 2036. He's 67 now, which of course is not old at all. But if he does this, he'll be in power until he is 83. And so the real question, of course, is, can he actually, will he be able to hold out this long? Will there be trouble? And if he holds on until 2036 and dominates Russia the way he has, what it means is that he has not developed a follow-on generation of leadership. And will there be difficulties when it finally comes to 2036? Or will he do the same thing again? Will he have the Constitution amended so he could stay in office even longer, God help us, into his 90s? I would be surprised if he wanted to. Anyway, it's not a happy situation for Russia, although obviously he won the vote. What it means, I think people were sort of hoping that in 2024 there really would be change finally, and what's clear is that they're just not going to be.
All right, Mark.
Hey, Mark, I have a couple of questions if you don't mind.
Sure.
Hey, I was wondering just how popular Putin really is in Russia. The plebiscite on the term limit was 75% plus. He won the 2018 election overwhelmingly, not saying that it was a free or fair election necessarily, but even from an independent polling group recently, he was showing approval ratings among Russian citizens above 60%. So is that accurate? Is he still pretty popular among the Russian people?
Well, I think he is popular with a lot of people. As I recall, the latest polls where he is at 57%. Now, in the U.S. or elsewhere in the West, that would be really good, but it's actually lower than he's ever been at before. And the thing is, of course, is that often these polls in Russia, they're taken in person. And when you are asked whether you approve the president or not, a lot of people feel it's prudent to say yes. Whether they
it's the opposite in this country, I guess, when they do polling, huh?
There you go. So to me, it's amazing that that there were as many people as there were who did not express approval for him. So it seems that his approval is slipping. And what does that mean? He's established this apparatus to thwart any kind of popular protest or call for change. But of course, it all depends on his ability to keep that apparatus under control. And historically, with regard to revolution, it's the key element is not necessarily, there has to be widespread public opposition, but that's not a sufficient condition. The real key is if there is widespread popular opposition, what do the security forces do? Do they stay loyal to the regime? Do they defect? Do they try to remain neutral, whatever that means? But we've, it's a question that I don't think Putin really wants to come up. But the thing is, the security forces are not immune to the forces affecting the rest of society, as we've seen in other countries.
Mm.
Well, I think we will be keeping our eye on Mr. Putin. Apologies for my audio difficulties, Dick. I hope you gave us a good recitation of the South China Sea.
Well, I think you can go back and give more because you were out there actually sailing around in those waters. When I was stationed in Singapore for a while,
yeah.
and basically a lot of refugees I would go out and sail in the South China Sea, and we were picking up refugees that were coming out of Vietnam at the time. So it's a beautiful body of water.
And I have a question for you, if possible, about that.
Sure.
What are the possibility if the Chinese manage to assert control over this area because no one wants to challenge them? What are the possibilities for rerouting the sea route through the Indonesian archipelago? Is that just too complicated? Or what is, I remember, in 67, when the Suez Canal was closed, shipping went around the Horn of Africa. They did it for many years. And I'm just wondering, it seems to me that this would be a shorter adjustment than we saw in 67.
Well, that's a good question. Let me put a map up here that might help.
I think as long as you got water, you can do that. But what you're talking about is time, and time equals money.
Right. That's the major issue here, and also just freedom of navigation. The United States has long held the position that freedom of navigation is a strategic interest of the United States, and we're going to stand up for the rights of mariners to pass in waters, the international commons, without any harassment. And this, I apologize for dropping back, but I think it's important to see what we're talking about here. A lot of traffic running from east to west through the Indian Ocean, the southern Bay of Bengal, through the Malacca Strait between Malaysia and Indonesia, past Singapore, where Ambassador Bowers was stationed, and then up across the South China Sea, a straight line across there, up into the Philippine Sea, and on up into Japan and Korea, who are major importers of energy and other goods from the east. There are other routes you can take, the Lombok Strait, for example, and a number of straits through the Indonesian archipelago, but that would necessitate traveling down the southwest coast of Indonesia, through those straits, through the Java Sea, and then up through the South China Sea. So it's simply mileage and money per mile, the cost of sailing very large vessels, and the timeliness of delivering shipments. Now, what I wanted to show was what the Chinese are doing in the South China Sea. We talked about the 9-dash line briefly. And Dick, are we seeing that okay on the screen?
Yes, we are.
Okay, so that's the 9-dash line. It's an historic marker that China has hung its hat on as far as the South China Sea claim. And you can see China, Hainan Island is up here near Hong Kong. The landmass of China has no dictate on that much territorial sea claim in the South China Sea. The United States recognizes a 12-mile territorial limit. We claim 3 miles, but we also acknowledge a 200-mile economic exclusion zone where people have the right, the nations have the right to control fisheries and mineral resources and so forth. But you can see that that 200-mile limit would run up against the 200 miles that belong to Vietnam, Philippines, Indonesia, Brunei, Malaysia, and so forth. So this really was a contentious issue. It went to the Court of Arbitration in The Hague about 4 years ago. The Philippines challenged the Chinese claim to the Spratly Islands, and I'll illuminate some of these possessions. These are outposts that the Chinese have built. Some of them on reefs, some of them on a rock that at high tide is underwater. They brought in shipments of gravel and turned these low-lying islands into military bases. So that's where a lot of these outposts are. The Philippines won their claim in the Court of Arbitration, and the court said that the 9-dash line is not binding on anybody, but China said they didn't recognize it. So they still claim that much of the South China Sea. Let me shift gears here and just show you a couple of slides. These are what some of these islands look like. And you can see that these are little more than rocks that were built up. They're reefs. A lot of these things in the middle of the South China Sea.
Your slide is still the map, Pat. The 9-dash line, yep. No, in fact, I think, one of the kind of funny aspects of this whole thing, there's something called the law of the sea. It's an international treaty that most of the world abides by and adheres to. The United States basically abides by it, but we have never ratified it. And under the law of the sea, if I'm remembering correctly, these little reefs and atolls cannot really be claimed as sovereign national territory. So this is
right. However, China is claiming these, and they're building them up. And you can see in some of these aerial views, runways, a lot of these islands and atolls and rocks that have been built up are now bases for fighters are deployed there, long-range radars. The Chinese have really built these up and militarized the islands. Let me try one more depiction here. We'll go back to the overview. Dick, are we on the screen with that?
Yep.
Okay, so you can see where these bases are. Now, in terms of securing or limiting access through the South China Sea, the Chinese have deployed bomber aircraft, and you can see the range of bomber aircraft on these islands extended from the mainland of China down past Indonesia. The same with surface-to-air missile sites around these islands. This ring is fighter aircraft, the range they could go to. And if the United States and China ever came into a conflict, we would be flying aircraft from Guam and US aircraft carriers. And the extension from these islands, from these bases, is significant. This is a radar ring. This is surveillance that the Chinese now possess, basically straddling the entire South China Sea. They can see everything that moves in the area. This ring is the ring of anti-ship cruise missiles that are based on some of these islands and could be deployed to any of them that would hold maritime assets and navies at risk. So that's the picture of what China's claiming, what their capabilities are in the Gulf. We can talk quickly about what the news peg is. And again, I apologize for not having that slide up earlier, Dick, but what's happening in the region right now is that the U.S. has sailed 2 aircraft carriers into the South China Sea, the Ronald Reagan and the Nimitz. And believe it or not, the captain of the USS Nimitz is a fellow named Captain James Kirk. So you can let your mind.
I noticed that, you know.
You could let your mind wander with that. But this was a major exercise. The Air Force flew a B-52 from Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana. The Navy went through the Bashi Channel, which is between the Philippines and Taiwan, in great strength and swept ahead for submarines. Presumably the Chinese were sending out submarines to conduct reconnaissance of this. And they had kind of a fiery rhetorical response from the foreign ministry to the United States presence in this region. They claim all of those islands and the territorial seas. This is nothing new, though. The U.S. Navy has sailed surface ships through what the Chinese claim are territorial seas in what are called freedom of navigation operations. So that's what's been going on there in the South China Sea. And
so where does it all end, Pat? I mean, the Chinese are forging ahead, building their capacity and capability.
Right.
We're insisting that it's not really their backyard and we want to go through it anytime we want to go through it. But somewhere down the line, somebody's going to have to do something to make a change, right?
Well, you know, the U.S. position is that we don't take a position on the claims among these various countries, but that we want to see a rules-based approach. And this was the language that was used back in the Obama administration when these islands started to become militarized back in 2014. And so prior to that, it was just an annoyance that there would be an outpost, and some of these outposts were simply a small structure on stilts above a rock, and you know, at high water, all you could see were a couple of guys with binoculars living on this little contraption built in the middle of nowhere. And now they're major facilities.
And aren't some of the other countries who have counterclaims to these particular areas, aren't they sort of saying, wait a minute, I mean, the Philippines, for example, has put troops on some of its quote islands, right?
Yeah, that's for sure. This isn't happening in a vacuum. The other countries, Vietnam, Philippines, in particular, given their geographic position, are increasingly concerned. And you know, they also have to balance this with the rest of their foreign policy vis-a-vis China. China's not going away in the neighborhood, and they're going to have reasonable relations. The U.S. presence, you know, we've become kind of fickle in terms of keeping to what we say we're going to do. So they've got to balance their pushing the sea claims. And it was kind of surprising for some to see the Philippines actually take China to court and win, but China said, too bad. Okay.
All right, interesting.
Shall
go back
we,
to Russia? No, wait, one last thing. What's this? What's his name? Thucydides?
Thucydides.
Thucydides trap. What is that all?
Well, the Greek wise man Thucydides set out the proposition that a rising power will be met with pushback from the dominant power. And that translates to the United States being the dominant power in the world, kind of a unipolar world after the Cold War, and Chinese expansion, economic, political, military, poses a challenge to the dominant power. So Thucydides.
And the dominant power challenge without becoming the declining power?
That's the trap, that there'll be conflict.
Yeah.
Some people say it's not inevitable, and they're betting that Thucydides was wrong. But if these encounters at sea,
Concept's been around a long time.
Yeah, and some of these encounters at sea between the U.S. Navy and the Chinese Navy, and they've also militarized their merchant marine and their Coast Guard. So there's a lot of steel in the water floating around there that there could be an incident. We had the takedown of a U.S. Navy reconnaissance aircraft. A Chinese fighter intercepted a reconnaissance aircraft off the coast of Hainan Island in 2001 after the Bush administration had taken office. And our airmen, the Navy crew on board, were held on Hainan for quite some time. They recovered the aircraft after the collision and successfully landed it in Hainan, but the Chinese held it and held the men until there were face-saving moves on both sides, and we got back our people and our airplane in pieces. So things do go bump in the night and cause incidents. We'll see what happens. But
let's move on back to Russia.
Back to Russia.
Dr. Mark, what do you think? Do you think that Putin's going to last that long?
That's a whole separate question. I mean, he is mortal like the rest of us, and it's just not clear. It's just not clear, And also, I think that I have a feeling at some point there are people behind him who would like his job, and I think that sort of what they thought was the assurance that he'd be leaving in 2024, was something that they were happy about, and now he's not. And so now, in a certain sense, that means sort of the next competition gets postponed. But I just have the sense that unless he himself develops his successor, it's going to be a free-for-all. And of course, he doesn't want to develop a successor because he's afraid that person will want to come in sooner rather than later, as he ended up having done. Although that wasn't his so much machination.
Don't you have a situation where, Putin and the inner cronies, and it would be kind of like a cabinet push internal kind of thing if something happened. But is there any effective anti-Putin opposition that's out there that could theoretically rule Russia?
No. I mean, there are some very bright people, but it seems to me that it's more likely to be a within system transfer unless there is some bizarre event that we just can't foresee at the moment, and that's just not and such events do occur. It seems like here we are in this pandemic, which a year ago no one would have given serious consideration to.
Black swans.
That's right. There are black swans, and I suspect that seem to be in abundance anymore. And there's no reason why Russia can't be subject to these as well. And in fact, the COVID-19 is hurting Russia tremendously. it's not doing. They're not doing well over there either.
Well, Mark, we wanted to get our money's worth out of you today, so we asked you to do two topics. So let's move on to a story that's really been kicked around in the news here for probably about 10 days. I guess it was a weekend ago, Saturday. The New York Times came out with an article about the Russian GRU and bounties on U.S. troops in Afghanistan. So let's hear what your impression is of that situation.
Okay. And just to remind the audience, the GRU is a Russian military intelligence. And these reports that Russian intelligence paid bounties to the Taliban to target U.S. and coalition forces in Afghanistan seem to be increasingly definitive. And then it's also clear, there's even been a date that's been given as to when this intelligence was actually reported in the president's daily brief to President Trump. Well, it's not clear that he actually reads these. So, it seems that this is something that has been happening. And so, that just raises a lot of questions. And to me, the first is that why would Russian intelligence go to the trouble of paying the Taliban to do something that it's already been willing and able to do on its own? It's like, this doesn't seem to be very cost effective. Why should they have to do it? In other words, it seems that if the Russians are doing this, there's some other, motives involved. And obviously, people talk about, revenge for U.S. support for the Afghan Mujahideen forces during the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan in the 1980s, and certainly from, Russian nationalist point of view, they're just doing to the Americans what the Americans had done to them. Back in Afghanistan, what's the difference? If you didn't like it now, then why'd you do it then? Basically, there's also some thought that there was this firefight in Syria between U.S. forces and the private military corporation Wagner, Russian mercenaries, who apparently, quite a few of them were killed in this firefight, and that the Russian government just disavowed these people altogether. But that they haven't forgotten. Some people feel that it's, that's partly revenge for this. But it strikes me that there may be some other more immediate policy concerns. And I think that, one is that in terms of the ongoing U.S. Taliban negotiations with regard to peace agreement in Afghanistan, sort of the bottom line for the U.S. is that the Taliban has to stop targeting U.S. and coalition forces. And it strikes me that these Russian bounty payments seem to be designed to, in fact, halt any progress on this U.S.-led peace process. Now, why would they want to do that? One possibility is that they just want the U.S. to leave, in a humiliating manner, the way that the Soviets did back in 1989. That's a possibility. It also strikes me that, or maybe the Russians don't want us to leave, because if the U.S. does leave Afghanistan, then who knows what the Taliban will do. And the trouble is that the U.S. presence in Afghanistan has actually been beneficial to Russian interests. In other words, that the Russian-backed governments in Central Asia, for example, which had been a target of Taliban-supported groups in the late 1990s. Is this going to happen again? If the U.S. is out of Afghanistan, then Russia has to deal with these security problems on its own. So one possibility, it seems to me, is that Russia is actually trying to undermine the prospect of a U.S. withdrawal. Now, I don't know. It's very hard to say. The other is simply that that Russia, anticipating that the Taliban is going to be in power in Afghanistan, they just want to curry favor with the Taliban and to make sure that there's no rapprochement between the U.S. and the Taliban regime. In other words, that they wanted to open the field for Russian influence. Now, it's not clear to me that there's some centralized process behind this. In other words, that the GRU might run rogue on its own, but it's not, although it's hard to imagine. On the other hand, I guess then another question that we have to raise is, how should the U.S. respond to this? And certainly some of the responses that have been talked about, that we will obviously raise this issue in talks with the Russians, or we will put on sanctions, more sanctions. This is obviously not something that's going to deter Vladimir Putin in the least. And I think that there are other possible, and we don't really know. In other words, it certainly appears in the news that the U.S. has done nothing in response, that President Trump doesn't seem to even want to acknowledge that this is a problem, and he referred to it as fake news. But maybe we're not giving him enough credit. I would imagine that if there's going to be a forceful response, it's not going to be something that's publicized, and we just plain don't know what that might be. But I would imagine that it's not going to improve Russian-American relations. It doesn't make the prospects for settlement in Afghanistan any stronger. And I just think that the U.S. has to decide: we want to leave Afghanistan? Certainly, President Trump does. Can we actually afford to? And what are the costs and benefits of staying in or leaving? It strikes me that this isn't like Vietnam, which I remember living through. There's huge public outcry for U.S. withdrawal into China. There's no such outcry now for withdrawing from Afghanistan. I think the public is quite comfortable with the level of commitment that there is, and probably would even tolerate more. This is something that President Trump in particular seems to want to do. I guess what it also shows is, it strikes me that as much as President Trump has sought to either minimize the threat from Russia or to indicate that he's able to talk with Putin better than anyone else, obviously Vladimir Putin has no such concern about currying favor with Donald Trump. That's for sure.
Well, it's a complicated situation. Mark, thanks for laying that out for us. There's the domestic side of it, who knew what, when, and why haven't we done anything? But we will save that for another day and another program that is less concerned with world affairs and more concerned with Oval Office affairs. Let's move on to Dr. Breck Walker, who's going to tell us about Hong Kong and the new security law that was passed in Beijing to deal with the protests and crackdown on Hong Kong demonstrators that came into effect. We've been looking at the story for a couple of weeks now, but now it's really taken effect and in a pretty harsh way. Breck, do you want to walk us through that?
Sure. Thanks, Pat. I'll scoot through this pretty quickly, I think. But on July the 1st, the People's Republic of China imposed what most people are calling a draconian national security law on Hong Kong that pervasively criminalizes dissent. And arguably, this is the first step in China unilaterally ending the one country, two systems agreement that China and the United Kingdom entered into back in 1997 when the UK turned over its colony, Hong Kong, to Chinese control and sovereignty. Now, The Economist magazine called it, quote, this national security law, called it, quote, one of the biggest assaults on a liberal society since the Second World War. So that's pretty strong. And Secretary of State Pompeo tweeted, the Chinese Communist Party's draconian national security law ends free Hong Kong and exposes the party's greatest fear, the free will and free thinking of its own people. The United States will not stand idly by while China swallows Hong Kong into its authoritarian maw, close quote. Now, I love that phrase, authoritarian maw. I'm going to look for chances to use that in the future. But this law was drafted in secrecy by the Chinese administration. Details were kept from Hong Kong government officials as well as the citizenry throughout this whole process. At 11 p.m. on June the 30th, the day before the law was going to be going into effect, was the first time that its details were revealed to anybody in Hong Kong. The law has over 66 articles and more than 7,000 words. And in general and broadly, it forbids acts of terrorism, subversion, secession, and collusion with foreign powers. And again, there's a very, seemingly, everybody's very concerned that the Chinese will interpret those terms very broadly. And for example, the first arrest reported under this law on July the 1st was a Hong Kong man carrying a banner calling for an independent Hong Kong, which was behavior that was perfectly acceptable on June the 30th. The sentences that can be imposed for serious violations of this law will be life in prison. Beijing, for the first time, is going to establish its own security force in Hong Kong to enforce this law. And China will also appoint judges to hear national security cases, and serious offenders could be extradited to China and tried in Chinese courts. So examples of prohibited activity might range from carrying a sign that is critical of President Xi, to damaging government buildings, to occupying and sabotaging transport facilities, to collaborating with NGOs that have a presence in Hong Kong promoting democracy, to forcing internet companies to take offending language off their websites. Now, interestingly to me, the law also applies to people that are not Hong Kong residents and that live outside Hong Kong. So for example, before we're through, when Pat criticizes something about the Chinese Communist Party on this program, he has violated that law, and if he ever goes to Hong Kong, he could be subject to arrest while he is there. So the overreach in this is significant. Now, let me give, if you don't mind, just a
Breck, I think I still have a few warrants outstanding in Hong Kong.
So let me give just a very quick overview. Let me check the time. Let me give a very quick overview.
No, you're fine.
Of a bare bones history of Hong Kong, just to set some context. Now, again, the Hong Kong name comes from a Cantonese word for fragrant harbor, or some say spice harbor. But as most everybody knows, I'm sure, it's a former British colony. It's now a special administrative region of the People's Republic of China. It's a city nation of 7 million people in 426 square miles. So it's one of the most densely populated areas in the world. It's a major global financial and shipping center, prospering not only from its proximity to the second largest economy in the world, but also from a very free market, largely unregulated, low tax economic environment. It's ranked at the top of Heritage Foundation's Economic Freedom Index and has been for several years running. It's the 35th largest economy in the world. It's a top 10 nation in terms of exports and imports, and it has the second highest number of billionaires of anywhere in the world except for New York City. Now, quickly, Hong Kong was taken by the British authorities back in 1841 as a spoil of the First Opium War, where Britain defeated China. In 1898, the Chinese entered into a 99-year lease covering most of what is today Hong Kong, and at the end of which, 1997, Hong Kong would revert to the Chinese. In 1984, Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher and Chinese Premier Zhao signed a joint declaration sort of describing the terms under which Britain would relinquish control. And those terms are often described as one country, two systems. And it's enshrined in what most people would call Hong Kong's constitution, which is called the Basic Law, capital B, capital L. And under that law, Hong Kong's part of the PRC, but the PRC controls Hong Kong's defense and foreign affairs. But China agreed for 50 years from 1997 to maintain Hong Kong's free social and economic system, at least compared to the mainland, and also protected rights for freedom to speech, freedom of assembly, protection from unlawful detention, and so forth. China also promised in that basic law to promote more democracy over time, and people might argue whether they have done that or not through the years. But at the end of the 10th anniversary in 2007, Margaret Thatcher said publicly that though she was surprised in that first 10 years, that the Chinese had generally lived up to that basic law, but things have changed since President Xi came into office. There have been increasing numbers of protests in Hong Kong over the last decade, and particularly in 2019, when hundreds of thousands of protesters hit the streets over the course of several months to protest a Hong Kong Legislative Council law that was being proposed to allow extradition of certain offenders on national security areas to China to be tried there. But so the questions that I guess I have are two. One is, what's going on here? And secondly, what should the U.S. and its allies do about it? I think it's interesting or worthy to sit there and think what the Chinese perspective is on this. And my view is that the Chinese perspective probably has 4 or 5 points. Xi is definitely concerned, in my view, that people that live in Hong Kong, as they get closer and closer to 2047, will demand more and more democracy and even independence. And if they do that, that will create problems domestically, perhaps, and certainly internationally for China. Secondly, I think there are plenty of folks in Hong Kong, and Xi knows this, of course, that think that the pro-democracy protesters have gone too far, that there are lots of business people and people concerned about their jobs who want a stable economic environment, and democracy is something that's down their list of priorities a little bit. I think that Xi believes that Hong Kong, these democracy protest calls for democracy in Hong Kong are in part supported by the West as a way to weaken the Chinese state and its authoritarian nature. And it's hard to argue that he's wrong about that. So there's that. And then one thing that's not reported in the Western press, so the only place I found this was on a BBC article, but under the Basic Law, Article 23 of the Basic Law, Hong Kong was agreed to enact its own national security law. And the language in that article reads very similarly to the language in the national security law that China imposed. It said Hong Kong shall enact laws on its own to prohibit any act of treason, secession, sedition, subversion, et cetera, et cetera. And Hong Kong has never enacted that law. So from Xi's perspective, again, maybe Hong Kong has not, in the West, has not lived up to their understanding of the basic law. And lastly, from the Chinese perspective, I guess I might argue that Xi's aggressiveness here, and also in the South China Sea, and we talked last week about India, may be as a result of the disarray throughout much of the West, not only with COVID, but politically, and President Trump perhaps creating some splits and alliances that haven't been there in the past, and bringing into question the U.S. reliability as an ally and those kinds of things. And I think Xi probably thinks, if I'm going to be aggressive, now's a very good time to be aggressive. But on this last, it creates perhaps a dangerous situation, and makes very important how the U.S. reacts to this, because now it's Hong Kong, and there's not much to be done, I would argue, about this. But the next step is Taiwan. And while we don't have a formal treaty with Taiwan, we certainly have an informal treaty, and American credibility would be hugely at stake if China did anything forcefully there. And I think that that's now a little bit more in play as a result of what happened in Hong Kong than it might have been a year ago. So what do we do about it? President Trump has thought we'll put some visa restrictions on Chinese officials. We'll restrict some exports that might otherwise go to Hong Kong. We might take away their most favored nation status. We might give fast immigration to really talented Hong Kongers that we'd like to have in the U.S. But as a practical matter, it seems to me that there's not a whole lot that we can do that's going to impact Chinese behavior, because the West is going to be very concerned about hurting its economic relationships with China, and they're certainly going to be reluctant to want to provoke a conflict of any kind over a national security law. So in my mind, at a minimum, what we need to do is get together with our allies, decide what our red lines are with regard to Chinese behavior, and those red lines may be no more rewriting the basic law. They may be, don't do anything with regard to Taiwan. And then those red lines need to be communicated, in my view, quietly, to the Chinese government so everybody knows where they stand on this. And Kissinger said, one quick quote, Kissinger quote, Kissinger said, quote, "The art of crisis management is to raise the stakes to where the adversary will not follow, but in a manner that avoids a tit for tat." I think that's a great quote, and I'm just not sure we have had or have currently or will have a presidential administration that can pull that off. But anyway, so Pat, that's it for China. And
well done. Thanks, Breck. Dick, last week when he did India, China, he left with the 2 questions and dumped it on our laps. This week, he had the good taste to answer his own questions.
I think I agree with him. I mean, that was you can do. I mean, maybe you can find some empty space somewhere and move everybody from Hong Kong to it, right? And then
the British have opened up slots for 3 million people.
That's right.
So we hopefully are talking with the British.
No, Hong Kong. I was there about 3 or 4 years ago, and it's a beautiful island, and it's a vibrant, exciting place. And of course, the food is beyond your pale, man.
Well, and the whole business.
Business, it's just vibrant. It's been free.
Yeah.
Whatever you can say about it, it's a wonderful place.
So it's a different chapter for Hong Kong.
Yeah, but I think it's over. And you're one of your good sources that I know you read a lot because it talks about the Navy a lot in the South China Sea, the Morning Post, right? And
right.
It's the newspaper of record for Hong Kong.
Yep.
And it's kind of like the New York Times. What's this new law mean in terms of what they can report and how they report it?
A lot of times the dissent is already being quashed as of the 1st of July. Yeah. A lot of times journalists see and make their own red lines without dictation from higher authorities. So they may self-muzzle. You never know, because this new law has some really biting penalties. Breck, that was a great layout of what's going on there. Now that you're becoming a Sino analyst, your friend Dr. Thomas Schwartz has a question, and you brought up Kissinger, and he has a book coming out in September on Secretary Kissinger that we're all waiting to read. And Professor Schwartz asks, should the United States consider changing its official policy on Taiwan or give Taiwan more secure protection and recognition? I'll let you take a bite out of that one.
Well, that would certainly be drawing a red line. And maybe that is something like that is the only way to possibly rein in Chinese aggression. But I'm curious what you guys think as well.
Well, we already have kind of an ambiguous mutual defense pact with Taiwan. We sell them arms, and we've warned Beijing not to make a forcible return of Taiwan, which we acknowledge is a part of China. So I'm not sure how much more secure protection recognition that we could provide. I suppose we could recognize them as a sovereign state, and that would be beyond a Beijing red line. They've said even political parties in Taiwan talking about independence, that's a bridge too far. So we're going to have Thomas Schwartz on here next week. We'll ask him. All right.
I think you're right, though, Pat. I mean, we've had a relationship with Taiwan ever since they left the mainland back in '48, and
sure.
We've built their military prowess. Singapore had a doctrine. They wanted to be the poison shrimp. They realized they couldn't stand up to China or to some of the other powers in the area. But if they were poison enough, even if they were just a little teeny shrimp, maybe the big guys would stay away from them. So Taiwan has an effective military capability. We have basically abandoned them internationally. We've supported a lot of their embassy activity around the world. And the recognition of China sort of torpedoed that. So they're going to sit where they're going to sit. And I think it's just going to drag on like it is. I don't see a military solution to the matter. And the economy and ability of the Taiwanese to take care of themselves is going to keep growing, it seems to me.
Right. Well, we have one more question on the China situation from James Atkinson, who, if it's the same James that I know, is a professor at Tennessee Tech University. He's been a great friend of the Tennessee World Affairs Council. And James asks, how does the earlier history of Quemoy and Matsu influence all this South China Sea's behavior? And those of us I may not have lived through that history. That was the mid 50s. I was a little young at that point, but basically a territorial conflict after the nationalist forces retreated to Taiwan. There was still a battle going back and forth, shelling, and it was really a mess. And the United States stepped in and got involved in the Quemoy and Matsu situation. I think from my perspective, I think we're in a different era now. China has built a formidable PLA, the People's Liberation Army, and it's the PLA and the Navy and so forth. But it's a different ball game in terms of Chinese military strength. It's their neck of the woods. Back in the 50s, the United States was the dominant power in the world. We still had thousands of ships, many of them still in the Pacific, and China wasn't spoiling for a big fight with us then. Now, the South China Sea, I'm not sure if anybody's spoiling for a big fight, but we're certainly up against the conditions that could make it easy to get there. Let's get back to Thucydides. He's wandering around the South China Sea, and we've gotten into shooting wars on simpler things. So I wouldn't draw a straight line from the Taiwan Strait issue of the 50s to the South China Sea. Breck, you got a notion on that?
No, I agree with you. I think China's in a much more powerful, influential position militarily and economically than, it's night and day. And they have a lot more muscle than they used to.
For sure. All right, let's see if I can get into another topic here without my audio going out. And we'll run through this pretty quickly here. Is the story about Iran and recent things going bang and boom in the night. But before we get into the news story here, let's just bring people up to date with the background of the U.S. maximum pressure campaign and the Iranian maximum resistance. You'll recall in 2015, after a couple of years of negotiations, the P5+1, that's the permanent 5 members of the UN Security Council, plus Germany, and the EU was in there as well, but they didn't get a number. They signed an agreement in Geneva with Iran. It's more popularly known as the Iranian nuclear deal, but it's the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. And that was signed during the Obama administration and provided for Iran to take certain steps, forswearing forever that they would not build nuclear weapons. And there were some sunrise provisions on things like an arms trading agreement that expires in the fall, which is another contentious issue. But the amount of fissile material they could develop, there was some extraction of nuclear materials from the country of Iran as part of the agreement. So this was really a major milestone in nuclear disarmament to prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. And you also may recall that in 2018, President Trump announced that the United States would withdraw from the JCPOA, which was one of his campaign promises. He said it was the worst deal ever made and that he would negotiate a better deal. So the P5+1, the Europeans in the P5+1 remained committed to the deal, as did the Russian Federation and China, which were part of the P5. The EU and the US got loggerheads over the JCPOA going away. The Europeans wanted to continue doing business with Iran, oil sales and so forth. but the United States had reinstituted sanctions. So that's been going back and forth. It's somewhat damaged EU-US relations. In fact, the European Union has gone so far as to try to develop a system to counter the international currency exchange using US dollars so that they could trade, their businesses could trade with Iran. So anyway, in May of last year, the IAEA, which is the International Atomic Energy Agency, which was charged with monitoring Iranian compliance with the JCPOA, and there'll be a test at the end here of all these acronyms, whether they were abiding by the terms of the deal, and concluded, and the US government agreed that Iran was complying. But then over the summer, the Iranian leadership decided that they were going to breach the limit on the stockpile of uranium. So they technically left compliance with the amount of fissile material, enriched material that they could possess. So here's a quick snapshot of Iran's nuclear facilities. You can see they're spread out all over the country, from the west, the central part of the country, to the far west. And Iran is a pretty substantial size country. And people are always talking about, well, why don't we just attack the facilities, et cetera. So these are facilities that are spread out from a military planning perspective. A lot of what they've developed is buried deep underground. And this facility at Natanz, what erupted in fire last week on Thursday, and you can see the overhead, the satellite imagery of the building before on the right and the building after the fire. And this was apparently a factory manufacturing centrifuges. Now, centrifuges are a key element to Iran's enrichment of uranium. And when they achieve a certain level of enrichment, they can use the material in nuclear power plants, and their position is that's what they are wanting enriched uranium for. They have a nuclear power plant at Bushehr on the Persian Gulf coast. But if you continue to enrich uranium to a higher degree of enrichment, you can produce fissile material that could go into an atomic bomb. So the news peg here is last Thursday a fire erupted at Natanz, which was one of their major facilities for enriching uranium. And at Natanz, there was a fire in the shed. There were also some other incidents in various parts of the country. A chemical plant, a fire broke out at a power station in southwestern Iran. There was a chlorine gas leak at the petrochemical plant near the port of Bandar Khomeini. The head of Iran Civil Defense suspects that some of these may have been related to a cyber attack. And Dick, you asked earlier about Stuxnet, which was a computer virus that was inserted into the Iranian computer system that ran their centrifuges, and their centrifuges were run into overdrive, and many of them burned up. So there's a history of foreigners getting viruses into Iranian cyber systems, and that's the first suspicion on the part of Iran as being behind these incidents. So Iran is up in arms. They're threatening response. They already have been threatening unconditional responses in the wake of the killing of General Soleimani in January. And we'll see what comes of that. So we're at loggerheads again with Iran. It's always an explosive situation in the Gulf. The US Navy's Fifth Fleet is in the Gulf. Iran patrols the Strait of Hormuz. So as in the case of the South China Sea, actually exponentially more likely to be a fire starter. We're again looking at a decline in the security situation vis-a-vis Iran. So that's where we are with things starting on fire and blowing up in Iran. I think we've answered all the questions that have been posed to us. Anybody have closing comments? We ran a little long. Apologies for audio difficulties. I now know how long AirPods batteries work, and we'll take remedial action for future webinars. I'll just mention that we had a terrific webinar today with the Lord Mayor of Belfast, with Carl Dean in his webinar that the World Affairs Council produces, Global Nashville with Carl Dean. We talked with the Lord Mayor about what's going on in Belfast, which is a sister city to Nashville. So please check that out. It'll be in the archive by tomorrow, if not sooner. And you can find all of our webinars. And I think, Dick, we've got what, about 3,000 hours of webinars?
More than I'm going to watch in a Netflix binge, I'll tell you.
But you can find all those materials on youtube.com/TNWAC. We've been fortunate in having terrific guests, and you can find all that on the website. Speaking of terrific guests, Dr. Mark Katz, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciated you coming in from, flying in from Northern Virginia. Are you a Annandale, Fairfax guy?
Yeah, Oakton, Virginia.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for joining us and lending your expertise to our humble show. For anybody who wants to follow Mark, we will have links on the website by tomorrow with his tremendous articles. And you have a personal website, and then you have something called Cat's Eye Review.
Cat's Eye View. Yeah.
Cat's Eye View.
That's my blog. Yeah.
Okay.
You can find it on my www.marknkatz.com.
marknkatz.com. So you can find his writings, and you're a prolific guy. I'm seeing postings on Facebook every other day of a new article. It's all good stuff. And Breck, welcome to the gang. We'll make T-shirts or something.
Well, thanks for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
You need to answer the question so we can get out of here.
Okay.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
How about that?
What's the question, and who was the guy?
Now the question is again, 20 Saudi Arabian citizens were put on trial in absentia in Turkey July 3rd, charged in the murder of what prominent reporter at the Saudi consulate in Istanbul in 2018? And the answer is B, Jamal Khashoggi.
Correct.
All right, and there he is on your screen, and it was a pretty horrific event, and Turkey is playing a little politics with it, but we'll see what happens. And a lot of people think that it goes higher up in the chain of command in Saudi Arabia than is currently being called to account. But history will decide on that. It doesn't look like anybody is forcing the issue. Well, Dick, Breck, Mark.
Just want to say thank you, Mark. He's been on the shelf keeping his eye on me back there.
All right, thank you.
All right. Well, again, thanks everybody for coming and spending time. We hope you're smarter for the hour that you've been with us. We appreciate everybody joining us. Again, please consider becoming a member of the World Affairs Council. And that's it for today. Thank you, everybody. Please be safe.
Thanks so much. Thank you.
Thank you.